What would you do if during one of these snow and ice storms, your community elected officials just happened to approve a multi-billion-dollar industrial project right in your town that was listed under a code name? And the reason why you didn't know too much about it is because it was surrounded by a bunch of non-disclosure agreements. Again, all of this happened while you and everybody else was preparing for a massive winter storm that your community doesn't really get that often. So you had to spend all of your time preparing. No big announcement, no public breakdown, no explanation of, impacts on your water supply, electricity grid, no discovery or discussion of, long-term impacts to your community. You've probably already guessed it, but nothing that I'm talking about right now is hypothetical at all. It's exactly what just happened in Marion County, South Carolina. And I think that the way that this whole thing went down matters more than a multi-billion-dollar project in and of itself. Now, albeit this story is being framed in a lot of different ways online, and I'm not here for that. What I'm interested in and what I'm reporting on is more or less the process, the power, and the president, especially when it comes to the involvement of rural communities. And if you understand how this whole thing moved forward, when you look around the country, you're probably seeing this process all over the place. We saw it here in North Carolina not too long ago. So on January 22nd, the Marion County Council approved what they call an economic development agreement for a project under the name Project Liberty. Sounds pretty liberating, right? That name wasn't branding, so don't get too carried away with it. It was a placeholder. And behind that placeholder just happened to be a hyperscale multi-billion-dollar data center project. I think it's estimated to be somewhere between $2.4 and $2.5 billion. Now, it's not a secret because council has acknowledged that they were operating under what they call a non-disclosure agreement. That means that they cannot tell the public what it is they're voting on behalf of the public. So obviously, because of that, residents are sitting there going, well, we didn't even understand the scope of the project. We didn't understand what even industry this project was in that you guys were voting on. All we knew is there was some project on there called Project Liberty. Sounds good to us. But they didn't understand anything about it until after the project was approved. And I think that that detail is important. Now, I'm not necessarily anti-development. This video is more about how decisions are being made, decisions that impact our rural communities. And I think that it really matters, especially when you've got these massive multi-billion-dollar decisions that involve very, very small communities. Now, to be fair, NDAs in economic development are 100% legal, but legality doesn't necessarily mean good governance. In this case, I think that the NDA actually prevented meaningful public understanding, and that NDA stayed in place throughout the entire voting process. Of course, it comes off after approval, and then the entire process just becomes procedural. The public just is there to participate in what's already been decided. The people of Marion County, they technically had a meeting, but they didn't have information. That's not transparency. My daughter would call that choreography in her dance classes. Now, this project was approved with a fee in lieu of tax agreement. Some people call it a FILOT, F-I-L-O-T. Shortens it up. So here's what a FILOT is in plain English. Instead of paying property taxes, the developer will pay an upfront fee, usually much lower in value than the aggregate rate. And this fee will basically pay their taxes for a good 20 to 30 years. So that $2.4 billion of investment that's going into this town, this small community that could probably use the money, that doesn't mean that the developer is going to get taxed on a $2.4 billion project because of the fee lot. Just knowing how this works across the Southeast, similar fees have, I would say on a regular basis, they've dropped to a fraction of what that tax would typically be. Now, once this economic deal is approved, counties are typically locked into it, even if the scope of the project changes. Developers are really smart. I used to work for one. Now, I want to talk about jobs really quick because I think this is where a lot of these data center deals kind of just melt away and fall apart. According to other reporting, according to statements coming out of the county, this multi-billion-dollar data center deal is going to make or create a whopping 20 jobs. Now, that's not unusual when it comes to data centers. Data centers are capital intensive, but they are not labor intensive. Now, I mean, you do a little math here, $2.4 billion divided by 20 jobs, that's $120 million a job. Of course, that's not what they're getting paid. I'm just messing around with some numbers. But most of the people, most of these 20 jobs are technical jobs. They're not even people who are going to be on site. They're not people who are going to be moving to this small rural county where they decided to put this humming data center. So you're probably wondering, well, if this isn't a job deal, what is it that they're bringing to the table? Well, they're bringing infrastructure. County officials cited over 7,000 gallons a day per building on this data center in closed circuit cooling. That 7,000 plus 7,175 gallons, that's an average. And here's, I love how these data centers work because they don't give you all the numbers, because these closed circuit cooling systems, they also require water makeup. Heat waves can increase demand. Expansion phases multiply the impact. And even though they're agreeing to all this and they have these averages, there are a lot of things that haven't been determined, like building size, where they're going to source their water from, water priority, what's going to happen and how they're going to allocate it in the event of a drought. We never have droughts in the US. Here's the key. Once permitted, industrial users often are granted priority access. Agricultural users and residential users almost never get priority access. And that's not a theory. If you look at allocation in all of these situations across the United States, that's simply how it works. Now, with all these data centers, water always gets the headlines. But I think that power is where the real costs hide. There's actually a bill right now going through the United States Senate to try and force a lot of these data centers to pay for their own power costs, because right now they're allocating those costs across the power company's customer base, you and I. That's not fair. We're paying the costs for private organizations to operate data centers to essentially get all of our information and spy on us and feed us ads. Data centers, they don't just kind of plug into the system. They require dedicated substations. They require transmission line upgrades. Just ask people in Maryland. Data centers require guaranteed uptime. I mean, these things are not cheap. We're talking about some serious upgrades, some expensive infrastructure upgrades. Like I said, who pays for this? Utility companies, they build the infrastructure and then they just kind of pass it off onto their entire customer base. And the thing is by the time the customers actually see their bills increase from all this infrastructure improvement and all of this new pull on electricity demand, the vote is years in the past, because it took them years to build this thing. Now, I want to talk a little bit, though, with this. The fact that it happened during a snowstorm, the public really wasn't aware of it. I agree, all that's sketchy. But I want to talk a little bit about why this keeps happening in rural communities. Rural communities are often targeted because, to begin with, they have lower land costs. They also have fewer regulatory layers and a smaller media ecosystem. Less reporting. They also have the economic pressure to say yes. A lot of these small towns need the money. I've seen it happen in my own town where we've had projects come in. People don't like the project, but there is a lot of economic pressure there to say, we've got to do something, especially with all the growth around us. If we want to maintain control, we've got to do something. Now, the reason why a lot of these things are secrecy is because once secrecy works one time around, they just keep using that model over and over and over again, which is why you keep hearing about data centers and these decisions being made under NDAs, closed doors, meetings being thrown during snowstorms. And I think that that is a real risk going forward, is that the lack of transparency around these things. And the more they get away with these approvals, the more you're going to see these code names for projects coming in with NDAs. And the more you're going to see these long-term tax abatements to get cash up front into these small counties. Some of these small rural counties that are in these economic pressures are basically signaling to these data centers, hey, come here. We'll accommodate you. We'll approve you. We need your cash. We'll do the NDAs. there's a system here that seems to be working across the country. Let's do it. So if you live in a rural county, let me just give you a little bit of advice on what to watch for these projects. Look for project code names instead of company names. Look for situations where there are non-disclosure agreements that go all the way up until the voting time. Look for projects that have large investment numbers and very big job counts. That's a pretty good disclosure right there that we're talking about a data center. And almost always, almost every single time these things come up for debate or for vote, the water and power details are so complex and so overwhelming that they're often just pushed off and left for later. So that's something that you will see with a lot of these projects, is that you'll see the water and power left off for later. We'll figure that out later. You know, economic development does not require secrecy. I think that a lot of people do welcome economic development within their communities. From a purpose of having a community, of governance, I don't think that it should come at the cost of informed consent. Anyway, guys, if this story sounds familiar to you, it's because it's spreading across the United States. If you found this video useful, subscribe and share it with your friends.